I'd like to now introduce our guest speaker for tonight, Dr. Roseanne Higgins. Roseanne grew up in Buffalo, traveled in the U.S. and Europe as a child, and later Ireland, which cultivated a love of history and cultural diversity. In 1990, she entered graduate school as an anthropology student, where she studied the relationship between biology and poverty in the 19th century. Roseanne's main interest was the institutionalized poor. In 1998, Roseanne earned a Ph.D. in anthropology from the University of Buffalo. In 2012, Dr. Higgins was invited by the UB Anthropology Department to join the Erie County Poorhouse Cemetery Project. Tapping into her historical research, Roseanne has brought to life the stories of these poorhouse residents through historical fiction with her series of 7 novels. Please welcome Roseanne Higgins.
Thank you all for coming. It's becoming fall, and I think it's getting harder to go out at night. I mean, we're still light out, but I appreciate anybody who can function after 5 o'clock, so thank you very much. So most of my scholarly research as a student and as a professor dealt with the institutionalized poor in this area, specifically the Monroe County Poorhouse and the Erie County Poorhouse. And as I was doing that research, my first exposure was really in the bones from the Monroe County Poorhouse skeletal collection from Rochester. And there was such poor skeletal health, I mean really bad. Fractures that didn't heal, and entire vertebral columns that were fused, and horrific arthritis and tooth abscesses that went up to the brain, just really bad stuff. And so it really was a profound introduction to what poverty can do to health. And I hadn't really been interested in the institutionalized poor until I started working with the Poorhouse skeletal collections, but it really quickly captured my heart, because it just to see the perseverance when you look at this person who had to have been in horrific pain every day as they went about their work or their day, and to know that they did it anyway, for years sometimes. It really had an impact on me. And then I got to know sort of more about those sorts of people when I started to study the Erie County Poorhouse, because the documentary evidence we have, especially from the Buffalo Plains location, is vast. And between the original inmate records and the Board of Supervisors reports and the physician reports, there was a tremendous amount of insight into what it was like to be poor in Buffalo. And so as I started to do this research, you have questions, and sometimes the data answers your questions and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes you're left hanging. Like there's a family that I'm going to talk about, the Pixley family. They were the first family to come to the Poorhouse when it was at the Black Rock location, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I was very interested in following them, and the historic record was only so cooperative, and then nothing. And so for me, writing fiction gives me an opportunity to end those stories, or to give some closure to those stories. And that was important to me because one of the things I learned when I worked on the cemetery project is that the burials, when somebody was tied at the poorhouse, they would be buried in the cemetery plot, and a stake would go in the ground, and that would have a number on it, and that number was linked to a ledger that had their name and their contact information, and that would be in the hopes really that somebody would come along and reimburse the county for their expense. But the thing that we didn't know is at the end of the year, all those stakes came out of the ground and they were reused, so that person sort of ceased to be known. I mean, their story ended as soon as that stake came out of the ground, because then we had no idea who was who. And so to me, to be able to give at least some of those people some kind of recognition that they endured a life that was probably very difficult at times, and then sometimes triumphed over that difficulty, that's what keeps me doing all of this. And so it's really a privilege to come and talk about the period that the poorhouse was in Black Rock, because it's not a period we know a whole lot about, mostly because there's not a whole lot of data. And most of what we know comes from medical reports from the Buffalo Medical and Surgical Journal, or from the Erie County Board of Supervisors reports, which were handwritten on reverse microfilm, which was brutal to read. So there's probably a lot in there that I wasn't even able to read because it's so difficult. So I have lots of lingering questions about the poorhouse's existence during this time period. So hopefully, as this project for me is always ongoing, maybe some of those questions will get answered at another time. So just to give you a quick 5-minute history about the 19th century, which I'm sure a lot of you already know, but what was happening in this country in the early parts of the 19th century, which was happening in other parts of the world, was the Industrial Revolution. And that had a profound impact on the social fabric of this country. And so prior to the Industrial Revolution, people made their living primarily as farmers. I mean, there were merchants, but really the biggest part of the economy was farming. And in a farming economy, you make everything you need and you barter for those few other things that you don't have. And so when people fall on hard times, when people are injured or sick or have bouts of bad luck, it's a lot easier to rebound in that type of economy because farmers always plan ahead. There's always food stored. You know, there's stuff to barter with. You're in a tight-knit community where you know people. Chances are you've lived there your whole life. So there's a church to rely on. You know, so the shift from that to the urban landscape. What happened with the Industrial Revolution is people were flocking into cities like Buffalo in large numbers, and they needed to be where the jobs were. Contrary to what you see on television, not everybody had a horse or a wagon. Most people, especially in this area, they got around on foot. So if you were working in the city, you needed to live in the city. And so it's a whole different world. You're living in a tenement that you have to pay rent on. You have to buy everything you need. You know, if you have, chances are you don't have a cash reserve, because who has a cash reserve back then? Most people don't even have cash reserve now. But the cash economy was a whole different ballgame, because if you became sick or injured or were unable to work, you know, the impact of that was considerably harsher. You know, the other thing about the reliance on the cash economy is sort of linked to this idea of the reduction in social support. You know, people that are leaving the rural areas and coming into cities, they're living in neighborhoods where they don't know people. There are not many churches in Buffalo in the early decades of the 19th century, as I'm sure some of you know. So there weren't, you know, parishes that could help people during their time of need. And so relying on that social network for help when you're in dire straits becomes a lot more complicated, because you don't know your neighbors the way you knew your neighbors. And you know, the amount of people that came here from other countries, same thing. You're leaving your family. A lot, you know, in places like Ireland and Germany, some of the earliest settlers who came here, you know, people had generations upon generations in the same village. So there was a huge amount of social support that disintegrated when they came here. And so all of that, combined with the fact that the industrial economy was dangerous, there was no OSHA, there was no 40-hour work week, there was nobody talking about job safety or anything like that. So mortality was high. Also, when you have people flocking into the city, there's not a whole lot of sanitation. We don't know anything about the germ theory of disease, and we won't until much later in the 19th century, so we don't really know how diseases are spread. So cholera, my personal favorite infectious disease, cholera sweeps through Buffalo and other cities like it many times during the early decades of the 19th century before we figure out it's actually in the water supply. Typhus, typhoid, tuberculosis at the end of the century. All of these diseases had very, very high mortality. And so what do I mean by high mortality? Half the babies born didn't make it to the first year. Mortality from age 0 to 5 was incredibly high. The average age at death for women was about 30, 35 years old. And that's largely because of childbearing. Childbearing was incredibly dangerous because we didn't have the kind of medical science we have now. For men, the average age at death was a little higher. It was about 45. But again, that reflects the dangerous industrial economy. And so what does all that spell? Well, what it means is that we oftentimes have children without parents, wives without husbands, husbands without wives to take care of their children. And so we have this growing population in need. And that is where the Poorhouse movement sort of comes from, this explosion of poverty at the beginning of the 19th century. So in 1924, there was an act to provide for the establishment of poorhouses in each county. So early on in New York, there was a need to manage the situation of poverty. And so the poorhouse system was established with the idea that you would gather the people who could not fend for themselves, you would put them under one roof, they would work to defray the cost of their care, they would stay only as long as they needed, and then they would move on. That's the system. Okay, the system was designed from the very beginning to be deterrent, and so the poorhouses were typically not very pleasant places to live. The county boards of supervisors, they had to appoint superintendents, so in the very beginning, the superintendent of the poor was an appointed position, it was not an elected position. And you can imagine that being the superintendent of the poor was not a very prestigious appointed position, so it didn't necessarily attract the most honest and, well-meaning of men. And so oftentimes, the people in that position were corrupt or at the very least, they couldn't be bothered. And so that plagued the poorhouse system pretty much all over the country, but also specifically in New York. Land was purchased as established working farms. So again, the inmates were, and that's what they were called, inmates were expected to work for their keep. So there was the growing of crops, the maintaining of animals, the maintaining of the buildings, care of the sick, cooking in the kitchens, anything that needed to be done, the inmates were expected to do it. And that's in contrast to, say, later in the century with the Buffalo State Asylum, which is also in our backyard. The Buffalo State Asylum work was encouraged among the patients, but it was not compulsory. That institution had somebody paid to do whatever needed to be done around the asylum. If patients wanted to work on the farm, they could. If they wanted to work in the kitchens, they could. But that was not, they didn't have to, whereas at the poorhouse, they were expected to. The institutions typically served not only the poor, but people who were sick, disabled, orphaned, widowed, too old to perhaps work in their job anymore. And so really what these institutions started to attract were people that simply couldn't do the jobs that needed to be done. So it's all very well and good to expect people to work for their keep, except these are the people that couldn't support themselves on the outside of the institution. So the expectation that they could do farm work or, heavy labor or even kitchen work, it was not realistic. And so what happens is most of the institutions, especially in the urban areas, they become very overcrowded very early on with people who are unable to take care of themselves. And that places a huge burden on the institutions to provide decent care. The superintendent hired a keeper or a keeper of the poor. And oftentimes that person didn't really have any training or medical background to deal with any number of sicknesses or injuries or disabilities that might come through the door. Same thing when these institutions also served pretty much as the working class mental health institutions at the time. And again, in the early years, they were not staffed with people who were physicians. So this is kind of a system, it's the origins of the social welfare system, and it almost was designed to fail from the beginning because it wasn't well thought out, and I think largely because it happened so quickly. And there was this need to separate what they called the worthy from the unworthy poor. People who were, who were sick and disabled were worthy, but people who were alcoholics were not, without the understanding of why is that person an alcoholic? Did this man lose his wife and his children to cholera? And, so we never bothering to, so there was just automatic, you're in this category or that category. If in that category, we'll help you, and if not, we won't. Or not in this way anyway. So the differentiation between the worthy and the unworthy poor has persisted in the social welfare system as we've moved through history into the modern world and continues to plague the system and its ability to do its job today. So when I talk to you, I just want to point out quickly this. This is the kind of data that I was dealing with. This is an actual excerpt, and if you can read it, more power to you, from the Erie County Board of Supervisors reports from the Buffalo History Museum. It's handwritten, it's reverse microfilm. I know this has something to do with poorhouse insurance at the poorhouse. It's cut off, so you can't read the whole thing. But these are the kinds of records when you're not dealing with like the nice, lovely printed medical journals. Those are wonderful, but not always very detailed. The real nitty-gritty decision-making really happened in these reports, and they're incredibly difficult. So I cannot by any means tell you that I did a thorough investigation because I did not. I tried. I really tried, but it was not easy. So in 1828, the Erie County Board of Supervisors was authorized to purchase some land in Black Rock for the purpose of building a poorhouse. So I have always wondered why Black Rock. I have not been able to find an answer to that question. So don't ask it because I don't know. I've been trying to figure it out, and I don't see any great discussion in the Board of Supervisors reports. I haven't seen any discussions in the State Board of Charities reports. I don't know why Black Rock was chosen, except that maybe it's outside the thrust of the city because the poorhouses have a habit of moving further and further out. So as this area becomes more populated, it moves out to Buffalo Plains. When the city heads in that direction, it goes out to Alden when it becomes the Erie County Home and Infirmary. So they're moving the institution further and further away from the general thrust of the city. That's the only reasonable why specifically Black Rock, I don't know. It happened pretty quickly though, because in January of 1829, the Erie County Poorhouse opened. It's funny how some things, like it took forever to make the decision to build the Buffalo State Asylum here, and then they took 10 years to construct the first wing, and another 10 for the site. So it's like that, this was open in a year. It wasn't as big, obviously, but I was always amazed that it happened this quickly. And again, I don't have an explanation for that. So the data that I do have about how the institution functioned and what it was actually like comes from mostly reports from the Buffalo Medical Journal. And so this is York Street and 10th, 11th, and 12th Streets. That is the Poorhouse complex as it existed in Black Rock. And so as of 1840, there were 2 male wards.
Roseanne,
Yeah.
I think you need to explain because people won't recognize it as Black Rock.
Yeah.
Black Rock was already, went down to Porter.
Right, I was going to say that. So that is what is now the area of Porter and Fargo, which is where DUville's campus is. That was Black Rock back then.
Could you tell us what the physical boundaries of Black Rock?
I actually could not tell you that.
Basically, think about Porter to here, but it started at Porter Avenue and then kept moving northward relatively quickly.
Technically, it was west of Richmond Avenue, which was called Reservation Road, because my neighborhood was part of Black Rock at one time.
Interesting.
My house is assessed to have been a carriage stop, a stagecoach stop before Black Rock, and I'm near York Street.
Okay.
So there you can see. And I did see in government records, years ago I did research about there being some type of building structure going up on York Street. I did see the records.
From 1828?
No, I don't, it was in, it's so long ago now, I don't know, but I was down at City Hall reading stuff.
And this would have been the village of Black Rock.
Yes, yes. Getting back to what the actual layout of the buildings were, so there were 2 male wards and 4 female wards, which is very interesting. It makes sense when you consider that if women were widowed or in a position where they had children to take care of and no male support, they would be more likely to end up in the poorhouse. So there were 2 male wards. The rooms were about 16 by 28. They housed a total of 24 men. This is in the year 1840. Okay, 4 female wards. Again, the rooms, not terribly big. And don't ask me what the bedroom is. I have no idea. It's listed as a bedroom. Most of these were dormitory style rooms. So why there was a separate bedroom, I do not know. It's just listed in the report as a bedroom. The female wards housed a total of 34 women. There was a room above the woodshed. Which one of these is the woodshed? I do not know. But it also housed about 16 people and served so that 21 by 25 foot space served partly as a workshop and then partly as inmate space. And then there was an additional building with 3 rooms, each approximately 18 square feet, that housed an additional 20 people. So we have just under 100 people during this year. But when we look at each space served as a dormitory, a sick room, and a keeping room. So that's their social space, their sleeping space, and their sick space. So there was no separation of sick patients from healthy patients. No, there was separation of sexes, that's it. No separation of age. They tried to confine families to a specific room, but it wasn't always possible. Because in the early years, especially in the first probably 10, it was a lot of families that came to the Erie County Poorhouse. But there was only separation of sex. There was not a separation early on of mentally healthy people from unhealthy people. There was eventually, but not in the very, very beginning. So this space, it seems like it might not be the worst amount of space in the world for 94 people, but when you think about that, was their only space. And then when we get into really looking at the numbers, which I'll do in a minute, you can see like under 100 people is rare. Normally there were at least 130 to 160 people there at any given time. But just to draw your attention also to what they call the insane department. So eventually there was a whole wing of the poorhouse that catered to people who were mentally ill. When I use words like insane and lunatic, I'm not trying to be insensitive. Those were the terms of the day. Some of the inmates themselves referred to it as the crazy house. So these are just terms that you see in the records But the insane department, in 1848, they had 34 cells. So these were exactly what they sound like for confining and safekeeping of people with mental health issues. And now understand that through well into the 20th century, mental health was not well understood. We had really no indication of what caused various kinds of mental illness. There were sort of these broad categories of melancholia, which would be anything relating to depression. Another broad category called mania, which would be any excitable kind of disorder. There was, seizure sorts of disorders that were labeled into the mental health category. Anybody with things like epilepsy, that would be considered an insanity of sorts. And the end stages of syphilis also produced mental health symptoms, so quite a few of the patients that had mental health diagnoses were end-stage syphilis patients. So there was not a very good understanding of mental health at all. So whether or not these patients were dangerous or not is anybody's guess. But there was a report in the 1848 Keeper's Report that they were very concerned that they did not have enough space for the number of insane patients that were not only living there but also needed to be admitted. And so funds were requested for an additional space, which would house up to 25 more patients. So they would have had the first space that had 34 cells, and the second space, which would have had 25. I'm assuming the same sort of arrangement. There was restraint used in the county poorhouse system, restraint that we would probably define now as cruelty, definitely. That's one of the reasons there was such a move towards, changing the care of insane patients in New York, was because most of the people ended up in poorhouses. If you had money, chances are you were treated in your own home by a private physician. But if you didn't, which was pretty much everybody else, you'd probably end up in the poorhouse. And this is before the Utica Asylum. The Utica Asylum came in about the 1840s, so maybe just when the Utica Asylum's open. But there was sort of this back and forth between the Utica Asylum and the county poorhouses. So if you were considered insane and they thought you could be treated, you'd go to the Utica Asylum, which was an acute care institution. So you could stay there a maximum of 2 years, and then if you were cured, they would discharge you, and if you were not cured, you would end up back in the poorhouse. So there was kind of a revolving door with the poorhouses and the Utica Asylum at the time, and that sort of triggered the establishment of a chronic care facility, which led to the Willard Act and the Willard Asylum in the 1860s, and then a whole bunch of different facilities in the 1870s and 80s, including the Buffalo State Asylum. So conditions in the poorhouse were not good for patients with a mental health diagnosis. And I even used that word, I shouldn't have even said diagnosis, because that implies that there was a physician who indicated that. A lot of times people were considered insane if they were picked up for drunken disorderlies, if they showed, what was considered a longer period of grief than one might be expected to have, postpartum depression. There were all kinds of things, that we just didn't understand about mental health. And so people ended up in these institutions sometimes for the duration of their lives because of that insanity diagnosis. Whereas most of the other patients, inmates who came in and out of the Erie County Poorhouse used it basically for what it was supposed to be, a temporary stop, to sort of get back on their feet and then go back out into the world. But the people with the insanity diagnoses also, often stayed years and even longer. So what I wanted to tell you after this was that the population does continue to increase. So we have more and more people. So in that original 1840s sort of glimpse at the poorhouse, there were like 94 inmates there. Typically during that period, there was like 150 to 160, 20% of which often were children. And so again, there was no specialized care for children. There were often people who died at the poorhouse. The mortality rates at the poorhouse tended to be a little bit higher than they were in the general population, mostly because people were arriving there sick anyway, and that the quality of care was terrible.
Is there any education on children?
Likely no. What usually happened to children, and we'll talk about that with some of the people that I want to talk about. Children, depending on the age that they were, could stay with their family if their family was there. But if they were old enough to work, they would be bound out to the lowest bidder for their care. So they were in the indenture system. And in the indenture system, it was not a temporary situation. If you were bound out as a laborer as a kid, then you were with that family until you were 18 or 19, depending on whether you were male or female. Or if the people who had you didn't want you, they could return you, but you couldn't leave. And so oftentimes that system, the indenture system for children, was terrible because nobody was keeping track of it. And so the living conditions for children were really bad. And oftentimes children absconded or escaped the situation. And so there was really not a whole lot of, so they were really, for as much as the Poorhouse didn't want kids there, it wasn't because of any moral or ethical issue. It was more expensive to have kids at the Poorhouse than it was to have them in the indenture system. But they would argue that this was not a wholesome environment for children, and which it wasn't, but the indenture system was much worse. Yeah, it was a very difficult time, and the Poorhouse throughout its existence in Buffalo really goes through lots of phases where it is poorly managed, and mortality rates are very high, especially during the epidemics. We had the first 2 cholera epidemics did take place in the Poorhouse in Black Rock, the 32 and the 49, both of which were devastating. It wasn't until the 54 epidemic, that when it was in England too, that we realized that cholera there was the water contamination. And then, then we still see cholera throughout the 19th century, but not as badly. But the Poorhouse had a particularly hard time with the cholera epidemics because the care there was terrible, right, and the diets there were terrible. And so there really wasn't a whole lot of support and they were completely overwhelmed with, cholera is pretty violent, acute kind of illness, and it requires a lot of care. And there just wasn't the infrastructure in the Poorhouse to manage that through any of the big epidemics. And the worst one really was the 54, which is then in the Buffalo Plains institution. And there, the mortality rate in the insane asylum portion was like 90%. Like almost everybody who was in the insane asylum during that cholera epidemic died, with the exception of like 3 people. And we can't. And the buildings were right next to each other. The Poorhouse proper, the almshouse part of it, and the insane asylum. And so why the mortality rate was so much higher in the insane asylum than in the Poorhouse building, I don't know. It had to have had something to do with the care of the patients in there. In fact, the hospital records become a lot more detailed after that cholera epidemic, which is wonderful for us because we were so interested in the health of the inmates. But prior to that, the records there isn't a separate physician's report in the Poorhouse, which makes this period really tough to study. So I've really painted a picture of a really terrible place. And for the most part, it was. But the thing that struck me when I was doing the research, basically I took all of the records from Erie County and transcribed them into a digital database for my doctoral dissertation. Mm-hmm. So I went through every record line by line, every person, saw the people who, kept coming in and out because of seasonal things, the women who kept coming in, with children in the winter, and, it's like a group of people that you get to know. And it really dawned on me that, even in this horrible place, things were not all bad. When I told my mom that I wanted to write some historical fiction about this, she said, "Don't, Roseanne, that's sad. No one's going to want to read that. Don't write that. No one's going to write it. It's going to be sad. Don't make it sad." And it really, I did. There's a lot of it that is sad. But there's a lot of it that isn't, because, when you get any group of people together in an unfortunate situation, there's always some good that comes out of it. And that's what I noticed in the records, and that's what I wanted to share in my books, because the system is vastly misunderstood. Nobody really even knew anything about the Poorhouse systems in this country. It's become a more popular scholarly field of research, but it really wasn't when I was doing it. So you do a dissertation and you spend just years on this thing, and you finish it, and then it sits on a shelf and nobody ever reads it. I can't say nobody, but to me, writing these books has been an opportunity to tell these types of stories. So the Pixley family, who I told you earlier about, has a very interesting story. All of these guys, this is their father, and then their mother, and then there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 children, ranging in age from 4 to 16 years old. And so their story is really interesting to me because, first of all, they were the first family that came to the Poorhouse. They're the first 7 names in the records, in the very first ledger. And so I got, and there's lots of other families, but there weren't as many large families. This is a pretty big family. And what really struck me was their discharge dates. Okay, so I don't know if Pinez, anybody know how to pronounce that? I've never known. Anyway, and Affia, they both stayed. They came in January of 1829, and they stayed until May. So they were there for the winter months. And what I learned when I did a little bit of digging outside of the records was that he was a shoemaker in Albany. He was living in Albany at the time. I was able to track him down, and he was a shoemaker. And what I discerned was that he was trying to move to family in Cleveland. And so the poorhouse, Erie County Poorhouse, was a stopping point, and they wintered at the Erie County Poorhouse and then made their way to Cleveland. But look what happens with the kids, okay? Henry, poor Henry. Henry leaves on the 16th of January. The older 2 leave on the 30th of January. Maria leaves in February, and then the younger kids don't leave. They leave actually after their parents, which is kind of strange. So I looked at all of this and I thought, well, what happened to these people? And knowing what I know about the indenture system, I thought, well, the kids were probably bound out, the ones that left early. And oh my gosh, here's this family that was coming from Albany. They were going to Cleveland. They were just stopping over to winter, and all of a sudden their whole family is blown up. Because once you enter the indenture system, they're there for, and look at these kids, are not terribly old. So I mean, we were talking about potentially a lot of years with somebody. So poor Henry, he's never heard from again. We don't know what happens to Henry. Marianne, William, Frederick, and the rest of them, I was able to find the rest of them in the historic record. Most of the men served in the military. But the interesting thing was when I looked at the 1830 census for Cleveland, the entire family except Henry was there. So somehow they got their children back. Somehow they got their, don't ask me how, but they did. And that to me is, that's one of those stories. Because when I first saw this record, and I thought, oh gosh, they lost, like their whole family got separated because of this one stopover at the Erie County Poorhouse. And that wasn't the case. Somehow they got their family back. Not Henry, I know not Henry because he was, the census is broken down to age, male and female age categories, and he was missing. So did he abscond from the situation he was in? I don't know. Did he die when he was there? I don't know. Unfortunately, indenture contracts are not municipal documents. They were private documents, so very few of them survive. I did look, but I didn't think I was going to find any, and I didn't. So I have no idea how this family got back together. But they did, because the census data tells me they did. So this is a lot of words. But the parents, so he ended up being a shoemaker again. It turned out he had 2 brothers that also lived in Cleveland, which was why I think the family was moving there to have the support of the rest of the family. Appia, I don't know her date, but she did make it to Cleveland. Marianne lived in Cleveland. I don't know her death date. William, the boys, like I said, they all served in the military, so it's easier to track them down. William Pixley lived to the ripe old age of 78. Again, I said we don't know what happened to Henry. Frederick died in Indiana in 1878. Maria got married and died in Ohio. Harvey died in Indiana. And Philander lived in Tioga County, and I don't know what his death date was. I wasn't able to find him. But it is a remarkable story that this huge family made this brief stopover, could have potentially been separated forever, and yet mostly were reunited except poor Henry. Henry breaks my heart to this day. I don't know what happened to Henry. But that's the part, this is what I mean about the historic record. Like I'm attached to these people, if you can't tell. And their welfare became important to me as their story unfolded. And so to not know what happened to Henry, poor little Henry, it's upsetting because you start to get to know these people. So hopefully Henry ran away and joined the circus and had a great life, but we don't know. We don't know what happened to poor Henry. So this is another story that's really interesting to me, and it came out of I'm sorry that that's cut off, the Buffalo Medical and Surgical Journal in 1840. There was a person who entered the Erie County Poorhouse claiming to be a hermaphrodite. And that caught my attention because I didn't think that that medical term was used and or understood during that time period. So that was interesting to me. But as the story unfolds, this is only part of the article. The article is really interesting. But this person comes in asking for, for relief, and the keeper of the poorhouse sees him, and he's disheveled. She is disheveled, has kind of long, scraggly hair, very feminine features, but so anyway, the claims to be a woman, or claims to be a hermaphrodite, but they're trying to figure out where to put this person. And so the keeper has the matron come and examine this person to try to figure out whether they're going to go in the men's ward or the women's ward. And so I don't know what transpires in that closed room between the matron and this person, but it's decided that this person will be in with the women. And so not long after that, the person dies of pneumonia, and the keeper calls the doctor and says, okay, this person's dead, get over here, let's see who this is. And it was a man pretending to be a woman. And so what they learned later on, there's so much of this is absolutely fascinating to me considering the time period. But because he looked not typically masculine, he told people he was a hermaphrodite because he got sympathy and help from them, which if you consider the early 19th century, it's amazing he wasn't beaten to death. So it showed to me this compassion that does exist with people. Like, we tend to think of that time period as very rigid as far as gender roles and very unsympathetic to anybody who's different. And that didn't seem to be the case. So he relied on this very kind of dangerous strategy of telling people that, and then having to explain probably what that meant. And then he actually was given sympathy and help instead of being beaten and sent on his way. And ultimately he ended up at the poorhouse because he couldn't find work, because nobody would hire him because he looked too much like a woman. So he looked different enough that people didn't want to hire him. And so he ends up at the poorhouse, where ultimately he dies of pneumonia. And I went back into the records, and the problem was that because this was reported in 1840, I don't exactly know when he was there. But he was actually a real man, so it was not a hermaphrodite. It was just something he made up as a strategy to help him get along in the world, which seemed to me to be very, as I said, risky, given the time period. But it actually was a strategy that paid off for him, and he managed to live with women in the Erie County poorhouse for a couple of months before he died. And so I don't know, I tried to find him in the records. I couldn't find him in the records because I don't know exactly when he died. So I wasn't really able to get a name or find anything more about him. That's kind of on my list of things still to do, because I've gone through every record in the 1840s and none of them really sort of shake out like they could be him. But in the early years, the records are they're just kind of very linear, and it's the person's name and whether they're a pauper, vagrant, or insane, and where they came from and when they came in and out, and that's it. Whereas the later years, there's lots of little notes in the margins, and in the hospital records, there's all kinds of notes, and so you get a little bit more information, but nothing for this person. So his story was so interesting to me that I did end up including him in Orphans and Inmates. So if you've read the book, the story of Michael Ketchum has to do with him, because, as I said, just a very, very strange story for the time period. There are other stories of people that came through in the Buffalo Plains location, which technically is in Black Rock, but their stories are really, really interesting. There was a woman named Lucinda Frost, and her story was really compelling to me because the doctor had made such a list of notes. She had something they called chorea, which in the 1850s could have been anything, because we didn't have Huntington's chorea until the 1870s. The Sydenham's chorea, which is the thing that leads to rheumatic fever, it could have been, who knows what it could have been. But anyway, she lost most of the maternal side of her family to this, whatever this chorea was. She had 5 children, 3 of whom died from this chorea. Her mother died from it, her grandmother died from it, her aunt's children died, so a lot of her maternal family died of whatever this was. And it didn't fit any category of disease, because even if it was Huntington's disease is a late onset disorder, it wouldn't have affected children. If it was rheumatic fever, that typically affects children and not adults, and were they all living together? So I did manage to find her in the census data, and I don't have all my graphics with her because, like I said, she's technically not in the Black Rock era, but Her story was really interesting because she evidently had a life before she ended up at the poorhouse, and she was only at the poorhouse because of whatever this Korea was. She was married, which, you know, she had children. There's no talk of her husband or who he was or why they were not together. He didn't, according to the poorhouse doctor, die of Korea. She had evidently had whatever this Korea was for 10 years before when she got there. But then she gets to the poorhouse and she just has one health problem after another. So you can see her being transferred in and out of the hospital for like things that don't seemingly make sense. Like she's got mouth infections, and then she's got diarrhea, and then she's got like some kind of fungal infection in her scalp. And so, but she's just in and out of the hospital, in and out of the hospital, and then she dies like without a word. There's just a death date and nothing else. And again, you're just kind of like, well, oh, what happened? How did she die? Was it related to any of these things? I don't know. And so her story is, again, she's mentioned in the books because it gives me, first of all, I really felt like she needed to be heard. I feel like this was somebody who had a tremendous amount of loss in her life. I have lost a child. I know what that's like. I can't even imagine losing three. Losing? Is that a word? No. Her mother, her aunt, all of these people in her family taken away, and then she wasn't. She lived with whatever this was for a decade or more before she ended up at the poorhouse. I think she lived with her brother. The census data indicate that I think it was a brother who she lived with before she was committed to the poorhouse. My guess is he could not care for her because of whatever this was, and that's why she ended up there, where she, as I said, was one sickness after another. So did that have anything to do with whatever this Korea was, or did it have to do with the fact the conditions at the poorhouse were the pits? I don't know. But she's sort of like, there's so much of her in that record, and then all of a sudden it just ends without a word. Like just boom, dead. And without any cause, nothing. And so you just, like I said, you get attached to these people. And when their story ends abruptly, it's difficult. There was a man named Michael Kinney who, they called him partially insane. I don't know what partially insane means, but he was like, anybody who had sort of too much energy, over-enthusiastic, kind of annoying kind of people could have easily been described as insane. And he was actually a fixture there from the 1850s, I think like 1854, and he died after the turn of the century. So he was there a very long time. And so anytime, especially at the holidays at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, the newspaper would often go in and do this big story about the Thanksgiving dinner the poorhouse had, or the Christmas dinner, to be like, oh, look, this great institution, they have Thanksgiving, it's terrible every other time of the year, but look, we have Thanksgiving. And so Michael Kinney would often be mentioned in the newspaper reports because he was this sort of excessive personality, and he was described as this man who, he'd always come up to me, hey, want to date, he was this guy. And so I guess that was partially, he probably was just annoying. But he had this really interesting life because his little case study said that he had traveled the world before he got there. He was in his 30s, I think, when he got to the poorhouse. So it's interesting that he had this whole exciting life and then spent the last 5 decades of it in the poorhouse. And the other interesting thing is that the laws start to change, and in the 1890s, what you guys are all familiar with Hayes Hall, right? That was the insane asylum of the Erie County Poorhouse, and it was expanded from the center building and then one wing and then another as the need for more insane patients arose. And so in 1896, all of those patients, when the laws changed and placed mental health care in the lap of the, is that my phone? You've got to be kidding. Anyway, so they all were shipped out to mostly the Willard Asylum, but also the Buffalo State Asylum. But Michael Kinney stayed at the poorhouse for his whole life, and he died, I think, in 1911. So it was interesting to me that whatever this partial insanity was, he was not transferred with the other patients. So that seems strange to me. Michael Kinney's story, again, ends without a whole lot of... but I think the saddest one, I have one more, and then I'll stop. There was a woman named Margaret Bauman who came in around that same time. And she was sort of the opposite of Michael Kinney. She was very shy and reserved. And again, partially insane for whatever that meant. And I think somebody who was excessively shy could easily fall into that sort of category as well. And so, whereas he was outgoing, she was kind of reserved, but they did sort of look out for each other, or he looked out for her mostly, she was younger. And the sad thing about her, when you look at the mortality records from the Erie County Poorhouse, they will tell you, because at that point in 1854, there was a law enacted that allowed the unclaimed burials at the poorhouse to be used as medical school cadavers. And so you'd see in the records, you'd see if they were sent to it. At the time it was Niagara University or Buffalo's medical school. And so here's Margaret Baumann, who we can track her in the records from the day she came in and out of the hospital a couple times. She's in the records every year from 1854 to 1909 when she died, and then she's a medical school cadaver. And you're just like, oh. I mean, they had to have known who she was. She was in the newspaper, she had been there her whole life. Everybody knew her. Like, who made that decision? So, like, there's all these emotions because then now I'm angry. I'm like, who did that to Margaret? Because, like, how could you possibly, who made that choice? And when you look at the number of deaths at that time, there were 30 other people. So why Margaret? She was older, so there was more than her that were unclaimed. So this is what these records are like. You go through, you get to know these people. Their story ends in a way that either you're dissatisfied with or it ends abruptly. And so historical fiction really helps me to continue to tell their stories. And it's harder in this time period. As I said, the Black Rock period, there's so little that we know about the institution. Most of what we know comes from that 1848 medical report and then the State Board of Charities reports about the laws that are enacted. All the state laws, charity laws, are summarized. And so we do know that, as I said, Black Rock was chosen. Why Black Rock? Who knows? They were given permission eventually to sell that property and buy the Buffalo Plains property. That took years. The decision to sell the Black Rock property and to acquire property further out happened in I think 1846, and then the Erie County Poorhouse in Buffalo Plains, which was the UB Main Street location, didn't open until 1851. So that took a number of years. And then when you look at the keeper's reports for those years, you see that the inmates were responsible for the move. Not only the moving of the actual physical, furniture but they exhumed burials and moved them over to that cemetery, to the Buffalo Plains Cemetery, which was really significant for us when we were doing the excavation, because what that told us is that there were people buried in the Buffalo Plains Cemetery, that UB Main Street campus, that passed away at the Black Rock Poorhouse. There were 120 burials that were exhumed and moved. Exhumed from where, I do not know, because we don't know where the cemetery was. It's not listed on the map that we have. So there are all these tantalizing little bits of information about the Black Rock period of the institution's history that are just really, really difficult to find answers for. So it's very frustrating for me because I like answers. But anyway, I wrote a bunch of books. They span the institution's history. And, the early one starts in 1836, actually 1835, although the institution opens in 1829, but the 1836 is when the Buffalo Orphan Asylum opened, which was a private institution. It wasn't part of the poorhouse system the way it's depicted in my book. That was a little bit of creative, again, telling a different story. And the series, chronicles three sisters who come from Ireland, which was a very typical story. A lot of the people who were in the Erie County Poorhouse were Irish or German. And so a lot of the stories were the same, where families would come over. There were always outbreaks of things like typhus fever. And, a lot of times people started out with a family of four, and two little sisters are the only ones left because of these outbreaks of disease aboard ships. Other times people came and they spent all their money just to get here, and then they arrive in Buffalo and they're destitute. So this series really chronicles three sisters as they move out of the poorhouse and into the backdrop of Buffalo's really fascinating history. So there's cholera epidemics, and there's sort of the grave robbing and the corruption that was typical of poorhouses at the time. That's what it was Bones has to do. The insane asylum and the things that were happening at the Erie County Poorhouse Insane Asylum and its relationship to other institutions is covered. And then, because my characters came from Ireland, we take the story back to Ireland. That was a lot of fun because my husband and I went to Ireland to do research. And believe me, I could have stayed, but I came home anyway. And then, the series moves into the 20th century and includes some of the basic characters from the original series, but moves on into other aspects of Buffalo's history. I found out quite by accident, for example, that there was a murder in the house I lived in North Buffalo. I had no idea. We were sitting in Bertha's Diner one day, and I don't know if you've ever been to Bertha's Diner on Hurl Avenue, there's no private conversation. Everybody just chimes in everybody else's conversation. And we were talking about how the Italian festival had been moved, and everybody's. And I had mentioned that I lived at the beginning of it and I worked at the end of it because my house was on Crestwood and my business was close to Delaware Avenue. And somebody asked me, where do you live? And I said, she goes, did you know there's a murder in your house? I said, no, I did not. So that was interesting. So the book, Mind's Eye Witness, has to do with that murder and how it played out in the neighborhood of North Buffalo, which of course is one of the later neighborhoods in the city. And I learned, we were just talking about this actually before everybody came in, we were talking about trees and how the sycamore on Franklin is supposed to be the oldest tree in the city. But a friend of mine who's an archaeologist did his tree ring circumference data method and found out that the white oak in Delaware Park is not much older, but technically older than the sycamore. And I thought, just given where it was in that area of Delaware Park, which I knew had been Seneca land, I just thought, what has that tree seen in 300 plus years? Mm-hmm. And so it was really fun to be able to write this story that sort of took Buffalo from those days of the Seneca days, through into the 1920s. So it just it keeps me out of trouble. I'm not somebody who should have spare time. So they're here if you're interested. They're also in public libraries, and they are a joy to write. The process has been slowed down a little because of the pandemic and all of the restrictions of doing research in places like the History Museum and the library, but I will have another one coming, I don't know, soon, I hope. Does anybody have any questions?
Could Henry have gone to Canada?
He could have gone anywhere. I mean, he wasn't very old, so the idea that he could have gotten that far by himself, probably. I mean, I think, my feeling is probably that something not very good happened. He either ran away, which is my hope, or he was killed there. The death of a child in that situation, I don't know that would have been common. I think children were treated very poorly. So my hope is that he ran away, which is probably what he did. And then if he, had a different name, we wouldn't have been able to trace him in the historic record. But I always wonder about him, poor kid. Yeah.
Were there a lot of babies born?
There were some. There were, I think the year of that report, there were 9. As you get into the later years, there are more and more, and it absolutely becomes kind of a home for unwed mothers as well. There was a really interesting case that came out of the hospital records, and there was a woman who, it was funny, the notes, the doctor was absolutely trying to say, okay, she's been here for 2 years, and she just had a baby, so, he didn't quite, but I mean, you could tell that was kind of his thing, she's been here for 2 years, she just gave birth, 11 hours of labor, blah, blah, blah. And so that's definitely sketchy. I mean, she obviously didn't come in pregnant. And so that became very interesting to me. So I went and looked, and the Poorhouse really meticulously recorded all of the births. And so I found it odd that there was no birth recorded for when he said she had a baby. But there was 2 days later a foundling who came in who died. So I wonder if she wasn't, if she didn't have the baby in the hospital, if she maybe had it on the ward and it wasn't recorded. I mean, I don't know, it was recorded in the hospital records, but it wasn't recorded in the actual inmate records, which was weird. So something was sketchy about that. And I don't, again, you never know what.
When you said that the people had to do most of the work in the poorhouse, were they also expected to try to get an outside job?
No, I mean, if they were able to get an outside job, they would be expected to leave. Yeah. So The 1852 Board of Supervisors report is really interesting because that's the year the poorhouse moved, in 1851, so it's the previous year. And so they always documented everything the inmates did to defray the cost, everything they produced that saved money, and then of course every penny they spent on everything else. Cost cutting was like a big, huge, and they hated to pay for burials. They always were wanting somebody to come and either reimburse them or dig up the body and send it someplace else. But they did everything. They dug wells and they laid floors and they made bedsteads and they exhumed all those burials, and they were responsible for the physical packing up and moving things. But the problem always with that system was that most of the poorhouse inmates were not able-bodied, but the insane patients were. They might have had mental health issues, but they were able-bodied. So a lot of the work of the institution fell on the insane population because they were able-bodied.
Two things. Did they grow their own food?
They did. They did. When you look, I don't know what the layout was in Black Rock, but when you drive by Main Street and there's all that sort of lawn before you see Hayes Hall, those were all cabbage fields. So there were, and it's really interesting because there's a period in 1909, the property was sold back to New York State for the purposes of the university. And so from 1909 till 1926, when ultimately the poorhouse became the Erie County Home and Infirmary and moved, the poorhouse and the university existed on the property at the same time. And so it's really interesting because you can see like the cabbage fields, like there's like when you're standing at Main Street, the part that's sort of over to the left, close to Bailey, is still most of the institution, and then you can see the campus starting to grow on the right. And it's really interesting that there was overlap for that long, where the poorhouse patients were still there until 1926, but the cabbage fields were all there, and like the boiler rooms and the laundries and all of the outbuildings were all still there.
Were the fathers recorded of those children?
No. Most of the time, it's just women who came in. I'm guessing most of the women who came in were women without husbands. Occasionally, there was a family who came in. And so the family occupation, there's actually kind of three distinct periods of occupation. In the early years, especially in the Black Rock years, it was mostly families. It was people who came in for exactly the reasons the Pixleys did. They needed a place to stay, which kind of makes that all the more heartbreaking because those are the families that were probably broken up more often because the children were bound out as indentured servants. So the family occupation period is the early period. And then in those sort of decades around the Civil War, there's a lot of widows, there's a lot of women because there's a lot of men who were either injured or died as a result of the war. And then at the end, it really, throughout the 19th century, you have all these other specialized institutions. You have orphanages that pull out the children because there's a children's law in I think 1870 or 73 where the children above a certain age shouldn't be at the poorhouse anymore, although they are. The records show that they are. And then you have, like I said, the Willard Act and the mental health things that pull those populations out. There's homes for soldiers, there's the homes for the friendless, and there's all these different institutions that are taking populations out of the poorhouse. And what it really becomes in its later years is a home for the elderly. And eventually it is just, that's what it becomes as the Erie County Home and Infirmary in Alden.
What about prostitutes? They wouldn't take prostitutes into the...
So the occupations were always either domestic if you were a woman or laborer. Everybody was in their early years. In the later years, the documents get more and more and more detailed as time goes by because the county wants more information. And there's always this, they're trying to study poverty like it's something contagious. There's this effort in the 1870s to collect all this data on your parents and your grandparents and what their habits were, and they get really detailed and interesting. But in the early years, it was basically they recorded your name, where you were from, if you were foreign born or native, specifically where you came from, like Germany or Ireland or whatever. Pauper, vagrant, or lunatic. That was it. Pauper, vagrant, lunatic. And then it was either domestic or if you were a woman, or laborer if you were a man, and that was pretty much it. They get more interesting as time goes on. Like the hospital records from the 1880s are fascinating because there's all kinds of people that go in and out of the Poorhouse Hospital. The Poorhouse Hospital is actually quite a good hospital. And you can tell when you look at the patient records because it's not just paupers and vagrants that are going there. The hospital was linked to the Buffalo Medical School, so it trained physicians, and they had a nurses program as well. Austin Flint, who was the first editor of the Buffalo Medical and Surgical Journal and a very prominent physician in Buffalo, was one of the Poorhouse doctors, as were many of the Poorhouse prominent physicians were Poorhouse doctors. So that hospital was actually quite a good hospital. And you would go to a hospital, whether it be Sisters Hospital, Buffalo General, or the Poorhouse, really more depending on where you lived, because you had to walk there or somebody had to get you there. But more importantly, did they have a bed available for whatever you needed it for? And so the Poorhouse Hospital served the large part of the community. It didn't just serve the poor. So when you look at those mortality ledgers, there's upwards of 5,000 or 6,000 people listed in them, but the cemetery couldn't possibly have that many people. There's not enough space. So most of those people, when you read the records, most of them were claimed by somebody else and buried elsewhere. And the records are pretty meticulous about telling where people are buried. And the coroners who took them, it's really interesting. The records get absolutely fascinating toward the turn of the century.
Just a little further touch on
Sure.
mental health.
Yeah.
When did they start moving them much more consistently to our psych center or Willard or Utica?
So in their 30s and 40s, 1830s and 40s, not only were activists like Dorothea Dix very concerned about what was happening in poorhouses in terms of the mental health population, but so were physicians, and there's this huge dialogue going on in the medical journals about, how do you sort of prevent an attack of insanity, and the care of the actual patients and how they weren't getting any care in poorhouses. And so the Willard Act really was devised to get those chronic patients out of the poorhouse and into a place where they could be treated under what was called the moral management model, which is the model that served most of, like the Buffalo State Asylum used the moral management model through most of its time. And that simply is removing the patient from the stressful environment they came in, providing them with 3 square meals a day, plenty of exercise, and things like, I always tell people, things like fresh air and light and exercise and leisure time, things that we all completely take for granted, were not part of the regular, the day of anybody in the 19th century. There was, people worked from sun up to sundown. They worked 7 days a week. They worked when they were sick. So the moral management model went a long way towards helping people who were just absolutely, I love the Bilbo Baggins quote, scraped like butter over too much bread. That's exactly how they were. These people were overworked. They were underfed. They were experiencing incredible hardships. And so the idea was to get patients out of the almshouses where they were getting no treatment, and in fact they were being really cruelly neglected, and into an institution that was supposed to offer that moral management type of treatment. So a lot of the patients in the county poorhouses in New York went to the Willard Asylum, but Erie, Niagara, and there were 3 others that were exempt from the Willard Act because we had already spent so much money building our almshouses. So the part of Hayes Hall part of it was already constructed. The other 2 parts were constructed in the 1870s. But because we had already invested money in an insane asylum, patients stayed in the Erie County poorhouse where they were treated by a physician, perhaps still not as well as they might have been in one of the other institutions. Until 1896, and then all of the mental health care falls under the umbrella of the state. So the county poorhouses are all emptied out at that point, even the 5 that were exempt from the Willard Act. And Hayes Hall becomes a hospital, becomes the Erie County Poorhouse Hospital, which is interesting because the hospital didn't want that poorhouse label. They wanted to just be called the Erie County Hospital, and the Board of Supervisors wouldn't let them because of the stigma of the name. But anyway, most of those patients went to Willard. They did not go to the Buffalo State Asylum because that was an acute care facility at the time. So it was much like Utica, where if you went to an acute care, they expected you to recover.
Right.
And they wouldn't have, although some people did petition and paid a good amount of money to have their family go to the Buffalo State Asylum. But for the most part, they all went to the Willard Asylum.
Are there still bodies buried on the UB campus?
Probably. The problem is that there was never any cemetery map. There was never any map to tell us where the cemetery was. So when they have over the years prior to 2012 had found skeletal remains in various projects because the skeletons were never buried 6 feet under. At the most they were like 2.5 feet under. So they were disturbed often, not huge chunks of the cemetery the way they were in 2012. So when they were digging in that area, they did expect that they would find remains again. They did not expect to find an enormous 400 burial cemetery. So there are provisions that should burials be uncovered again to make sure that they're buried in Assumption Cemetery with the others. But it's interesting because in New York State is the only state in the entire country without an unmarked burial bill. So we're the only state, or at least we were at the time, it might have changed now, the only state where there is no legislation to tell you what to do should you come across an unmarked cemetery, of which they're everywhere. So we had to go to court and get a court order to be able to do a salvage excavation to get those burials out of the way so that whatever they were doing to Michael Road could be done. And then we had special permission for only 1 year to study them in a non-invasive way. So we couldn't take the bone fragment. We had to just do like x-rays and gross analysis and stuff like that. And then when that year was complete, even though they weren't reinterred for a few years later, they were put in a safe location and left in peace until they were reinterred.
So wait, you're saying UV on Main Street? From where? From like St. Joe's?
No. Well, that's all Poorhouse land. The cemetery is that stretch of where the parking lots are that goes up Bailey Avenue.
That's the cemetery?
Well, it's further back by where Michael Road. You know where Michael Road is? Yeah, that's where we found the larger section.
And where were the cabbage fields?
In front of Hayes Hall. I mean, I don't know how much was farmland in that area. I know that a lot of the farmland was there were cabbage patches and cabbage fields in front of the area where Hayes Hall is.
I didn't know that, I wasn't there.
Just want to thank Roseanne for a wonderful. I think it's very interesting just to think that we're only a couple generations separated from those times. And
Yeah, I know.
unfortunate circumstances. So thank you very much for sharing your research and your stories.
Thank you.
Please talk to Roseanne further about her books.
Yes, please do.
Thank you all for coming.